We all have memories from our childhood. It just makes us wince a little bit. Things that we said or did that as an adult we find rather embarrassing. And one such memory takes me back to the fourth grade. In school, I decided one day that the name I was putting on the top of my classwork just wasn't quite descriptive enough. I'd been putting Greg S. or Greg Squires on my papers, because after all, that's my name. But for some reason, I got all full of myself. And so I started writing Greg the Great on my papers. Greg the Great. Of course, as a child, I had no idea there was a Catholic pope from long ago named Gregory the Great. I just thought that I was being clever, that I came up with this idea all by myself. And so for the next couple weeks, I put Greg the Great on all my school papers. And then one day I decided that Greg the Great wasn't quite descriptive enough. It kind of fell short of describing who I really was. And so I added more to my name. Instead of Greg the Great, I now began putting Greg the Great, the greatest of all the greater greats. Well, as I said, I now look back at that memory with embarrassment. I kind of wonder what my teacher must have thought. It was all just childhood nonsense. But imagine if I really thought of myself like that, even today. Imagine if I went around acting like I was the greatest man ever alive. I truly believe that I was far superior to any person in town, and everyone else was far inferior to my greatness. It's rather silly and sad, isn't it? And yet for some people, they aren't too far from believing in their own greatness. Maybe they think of themselves as the most beautiful, or the smartest, or the richest, or the coolest, or the most powerful, or whatever. And they get it into their heads that others around them don't quite measure up. Well, Jesus once attended a dinner party at a house of a prominent Pharisee. And one thing he noticed was how some at the party went out of their way to seek places of honor at the table. It was quite a prideful thing to do. And so he told his disciples a parable. And we see this parable in Luke 14. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this man your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, in Jesus' day, when a Jewish family held a dinner party, they'd arrange couches in kind of a U shape with a low U-shaped table in front of them. And this U-shaped table arrangement was called a triclinium. It was adopted from the Romans. And nobody sat in the middle of the U because that's where the servers worked or entertainment was presented. So guests would recline on their left elbows and use their right hands for eating. And there was a definite seating arrangement for the triclinium. At the middle table were the seats of highest honor. And people naturally loved to be honored, and so everyone wished to be seated in the middle section. But of course, not everyone could, and so the seats around the two sides of the U would be used for those of less honor. And the further a person was from the middle table, the less status he or she possessed. So Jesus imagines someone arrives for dinner and places himself in the very best seat, right smack in the middle. He's feeling all good about himself, kind of like I would feel if I had Dodger tickets in the first row, right behind home plate. But then, someone more respected shows up. So now there's a problem. The guy in the seat of honor is obviously outranked. He's in the wrong place. and he would be asked to move to a lower seat. So imagine that I somehow managed to get a seat behind home plate at Dodger Stadium. And Kershaw was pitching that very night, and I was really excited. I'd never seen him so close up, and from my prime seats, I could see every movement of every pitch. Well, of course, I wanted all my friends to know of my elevated status in the stadium. So I get out my phone, take a few selfies of myself, and post them on Facebook and Instagram for all the world to see. As I take my selfies, I announce to the crowd sitting in the section, "Front row, home plate, best seats in the house." And I'm very pleased with myself. But then, right before the national anthem, a security guy comes to where I'm sitting and asks to see my tickets. And so I ask, "Is there a problem?" And the guard replies, "Just need to check something." So I sheepishly show him my tickets, and he frowns disapprovingly. And he says, "Sir, your seats are not field level, they're upper deck. I must ask you to move to your ticketed seats." And so as the security guy leads the way, I follow up the aisle with my head held down in disgrace. The crowd boos and jeers, and I'm just utterly disgraced. What's kind of the situation Jesus describes? Someone arrives early, grabs the best seat, feels really good about his self-proclaimed status. But then, someone else arrives who's actually a person of honor, and the seat grabber is dismissed in disgrace to a seat of low status. Pride is a sinful condition. It's selfish. It's putting me first. It's thinking too much of me and too little of others. And really, at the root of all sin is selfishness, a desire for what I want instead of yielding to God's will. Pride has always been a common human flaw. We remember the story of the Tower of Babel, when the people attempted to make a skyscraper like the world had never seen. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves." It was both a power grab, as they sought the position of God, as well as blatant self-promotion, as their motivation was to make a name for themselves. But pride isn't just left in the realm of the unbelieving world. Pride has a way of creeping into the family of God as well. We find stories in the Gospels of Jesus' disciples displaying such selfish pride. One such story is found in Mark 9. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet, because on the way they'd argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all." Did you get what just happened there? Jesus had just told his disciples he was going to be betrayed and would die and later rise. And man, that's some sobering news. You would think that hearing Jesus talk about betrayal and death, they'd be quiet and contemplative. But they weren't. Instead, they were arguing. And what were they arguing about? Who was the greatest? So maybe they were focusing on Jesus' resurrection and were arguing about who would be the greatest in his coming kingdom. Maybe. But it's just as likely that when they heard Jesus speak of his death, they argued about who was the greatest and therefore most qualified to be the leader if Jesus died. So they took the death and resurrection of Jesus and made it all about them. Well, that's pride. But our sinful nature is plagued with pride. We want to make a name for ourselves. We want to be honored. We want to feel, well, better than others. Judy and I, we recently made some airline reservations between California and South Carolina. And part of the booking process with a plane is to choose seats. And Judy and I, we talked about our choice of seats for quite a while. And we looked at a diagram of the plane on the airline's website. And we studied it. We discussed the best possible seats that we could choose of those that remained. We discussed the merit of sitting in different sections of the plane. And we finally made our choice based upon the belief that it was the very best we could do. Well, everyone that I know chooses airline seats in a similar way. I don't know of anyone who studies a diagram of a plane in order to choose the least desirable seats on the plane. I've never known anyone who purposely chooses bad seats so that someone else can have a better experience. No, we generally choose the best for ourselves. But the banquet seats that Jesus spoke of and the airline seats I talked about are just illustrations of a sinful condition, that need in our lives to put self before others. Well, of course, there's really nothing wrong with good airline seats. And there's nothing wrong with field level seats behind home plate either. But often, the seats of honor are accompanied with an attitude of pride. And we get this smug feeling of superiority over others. We put on airs, acting as if we are better than others. But we've got to know that such an attitude dishonors Christ. Such an attitude is directly opposite of the attitude in life that Christ expects of us. It's not how he lived, and certainly not how he wants us to live. Jesus taught that it's better to be humble than to be humiliated. In Jesus' parable, the person who quickly claimed the best seats in the house was told that the seat he chose actually belonged to someone else. And so he was escorted to the least desirable seat instead. This parable reminds me of something that really happened to me and Alan as we were working at a wedding several years ago. We were at the wedding to videotape it. And after the ceremony, as the reception began, the bride kindly remarked to us that she had plates for us. We were welcome to eat. Well, we thanked her for her thoughtfulness. And after preparing our gear to shoot the reception, we found a seat in the back of the reception room and waited to be served. Well, the food came, so we started eating and we chatted with the wedding guests that were seated at the table with us. And suddenly, right in the middle of our meals, the wedding coordinator came to us and asked what we were doing. Well, we explained that we were invited by the bride to enjoy a meal at the reception. But then the wedding coordinator said we weren't supposed to be eating with the invited guests. We were supposed to be with the hired help, the DJ, the photographer, and others who were eating in a small room somewhere else. And she made it very clear we did not belong. We did not have the right to be enjoying ourselves among the invited guests. Well, I didn't eat another bite. Suddenly the food just didn't taste good. My face flushed red and my head started hurting. I didn't know I'd done anything wrong and I just felt utterly humiliated. But as bad as I felt, Jesus was describing in his parable an even more humiliating scene. In Jesus' day, shame and honor were among the most important values in first century Jewish culture. And to be kicked out of a seat of prominence and assigned a lowly seat at the very end of the table would have been the worst kind of humiliation. That memory would haunt him for the rest of his life. So, the moral of the story that Jesus attached to the parable was to choose the lowly seat to begin with instead of assuming a place of honor. If you're upgraded, good for you. If not, at least you won't embarrass yourself. Well, do you remember what Jesus said to his disciples when they were arguing over who was the greatest? He said, if anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all. Well, do you care what Jesus thinks about you? Do you want him to be pleased with your life and priorities? If so, Jesus said we've got to rid ourselves of selfish pride and be willing to serve instead of be served. And Jesus demonstrated this servanthood in his own life, putting the needs of others before his own, and giving his very life to save us from sin. He could have demanded honor and glory and recognition. He is, after all, God. But he came to earth to serve. He freely gave of himself as he humbly met the needs of others. And his humility ultimately took him to the cross to die for our sins. There are those who do good deeds in order to make themselves just look good. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he said, "Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by men. I tell you the truth. They have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Well, today we don't announce our good deeds by blowing a trumpet, but we'll talk about it. We'll post pictures of our good deeds on Facebook and Instagram. We'll alert the press. Jesus taught that servanthood in its purest form is private. We help others even when no one knows and no one sees. We don't talk ourselves up. We don't seek recognition. During the Great Depression, there was a guy named Sam Stone who lived in Canton, Ohio. And he was a Jewish immigrant and was in the clothing business. And times were hard for everyone during the Depression. But Sam was more fortunate than most. And so during one Christmas season, he decided to bring some cheer to others. He made up a fictitious name and put an ad in the local paper, basically saying that if a person was in need, they would write the P.O. box in the ad with their story, and he would consider helping them with a no-strings-attached gift of $5. Back in those days, $5 was more like $75 today. And so for many weeks, Sam received letters from people in need. And day after day, Sam placed $5 in an envelope and sent them to those needy families who wrote him, wishing them a Merry Christmas. Well, nobody ever knew who sent out those $5 gifts until Sam's daughter was cleaning out the attic of her father's house after his death and found this big stack of letters that Sam had kept. Well, then she put it all together. And she began researching the families who wrote to her father. And she put her findings in a book that told these wonderful stories of the people who were touched by Sam's generosity. But it's interesting that for as long as Sam Stone lived, nobody knew that he was the one who gave those $5 gifts. His giving was completely secret. He received no fame, no recognition or reward. He simply and privately gave to people in need. And that's humility. Giving of ourselves and giving God the glory. Jesus summed up his parable by saying, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." In other words, we can't force the issue. We can't do what John and James once did, insisting that Jesus promised them the seats of highest honor in his kingdom. For what Jesus said, the highest honor is awarded to those who live humble lives of service on earth. But such humility must be genuine. If you live what seems to be a humble life, but you're only doing it to receive a reward, you've missed the boat. That's actually a prideful attitude. That's pretty much the same as people who become Christians only because they want to live in a big mansion in heaven. Our humility must be genuine, and our service given out of love. Anything else falls short. And as we discussed earlier, this life of humility is a struggle. It's a daily struggle. People naturally want to be honored. We like the feeling of being better than others. But that's a sinful attitude, and one that must be constantly subdued. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted.